My dad died when I was 10 years old of an inoperable brain tumor. I'll never forget that final night, watching him die. He was still at home. My mom didn't want him in an unfamiliar place and also wished for him to die comfortably. My babysitter was called to take me for the night. I knew why, but I still asked my mom if he was going to die. He was shaking, choking, coughing, and staring towards the wall. But from the look of his gaze, not at it, he was looking into something invisible to me, or so it seemed. I've never seen a look like that before, but then again, I'd never seen a person in the last few hours of life clinging to it with a relentless, horrible disease. Before we left, I asked my mom, "Is Dad going to die tonight?" "No, honey, Daddy will be alright." She kissed me, and I kissed Dad on his forehead, and we left. I was still so worried about him that I called her at 12:30 a.m., asking if he was dead. "No, Dad's okay, honey. Get sleep." And I did. It was a burden off my back. People think it's wrong that I never went to his viewing or funeral. What they don't understand is that the last time I saw him, he was alive, and I didn't want to see his dead body. I wanted just a shred of plausibility in my brain that he possibly may have just left and will eventually come back home. The next morning I came home, my entire family was there, and the moment I walked in, the conversation halted and my mom knelt down and told me, "Daddy's gone." I ran to my room and shut the door. What happened after was a blur. As months, even a few years passed, I would have these recurring dreams about him. In the dream, we would get a knock on the door. I'd look through the peephole and then excitedly swing the door open. Dad had come home, but he wasn't the same. He looked like my dad, but also like some half-dead incarnation of Gus from Pet Sematary 2, skin extremely pale, eyes a reddish pink covered in lesions, a walking disease spreader. And just before I'd go to let him in by opening the screen door, my mom would run to me, screaming no, and would shut the door at him, telling me he's not Daddy anymore. These were only dreams, but strange things had begun occurring months before this, and not long after his death. My mom put some sort of adhesive glue over the peephole to our door on the outside, so I can't look outside, and also I was told to never open that door unless she said so, but it's almost always going to be no. We began to get persistent knocks at our door, maybe once a month for 2 years or so. If the doorbell rang, my mom would give me permission to open it, but if it was that slow rapping at the door, I was told to go to my room. I'd come down 10 minutes later to find her crying and smoking in the kitchen. I asked, but she wouldn't tell. I was grounded if I didn't run to my room when this happened, over and over again, repeatedly until she was nearing a breakdown state. Then, one day it happened, when I was home alone for 5 minutes while my mom ran down the street to the store. Knock, knock, knock. I stayed put. Knock, knock, knock. "No, I won't do it." Louder. Knock, knock, knock. Then it stopped. I went against Mom's demands and opened the door. Walking across our yard was a man, but I could only see the back of him. He was wearing a sweater and sweatpants. His head was shaved, but there was something else. I had to squint to see it before recoiling in horror. Running down the back of his head were large black stitches, staples like the type they suture a head together with after a major brain surgery. "Dad?" I called out faintly. He stopped, just for a second, and then walked off into the woods. He never turned to look in my direction. "Dad, I just want this to be over. I've missed you so much. I hope someday I'll know what really happened." In the year 1983, A boy named Henry Patterson was born. At the time of birth, Henry was believed to have a twin that was going to be named Charlie. Although as the baby was delivered, doctors were in shock and somewhat disgusted by what they had seen, for the newborn had a face on the back of his skull. Doctors found that Henry's twin had died early on in the womb, and they believed that Henry merged with some of the deceased twin's features, causing this deformity. Henry's parents, James and Abigail Peterson, demanded that they perform surgery to remove the face, but doctors deemed the surgery too risky. This was very upsetting and hard for his parents to handle. Although over time, they began to move on despite the resentment they felt towards their deformed son. As time went on, James and Abigail decided it was time for Henry to begin school. In fear of their son being bullied, they decided to homeschool Henry. Henry had a very hard time socializing with family members or anyone other than his parents. He spent much of his time in his room, staring himself in the mirror, wondering why he was so different. Henry wanted to go to public school and make friends like a normal kid, but deep down he knew this would never happen. Henry became a very sad child growing up and had a hard time showing his emotions until October of 1991. Henry was 8 years old at the time and started to seem more talkative and outgoing than before. James and Abigail were never very good parents to Henry and even ignored him most of the time. They spent each day wishing their son was like the other boys. They hated the fact that they couldn't take their own son out in public and had to stay at home most of the time. Nonetheless, Henry would talk to them all the time because he had no one else to communicate with. But both his parents would hardly ever give him any attention, although they did take notice when Henry stopped trying to get their attention and started hearing him talking to himself in his room. Whenever they would walk into his room to ask him who he was talking to, he would deny he was talking at all and even got a little bit angry when he was confronted. Eventually, his parents stopped asking and just ignored it because after all, Henry was happier anyways. One night, however, James and Abigail are asleep and Henry runs to his parents' room and wakes them up. They could tell he seemed frightened, and his mother asked, "What's wrong? We are trying to sleep." Henry replied with, "He's scaring me." His mother was still pretty tired and didn't seem to register what he said. Meanwhile, his father was still asleep. She told him, "I don't care, Henry, just please go back to bed." This happened a couple times over the span of a few weeks, until one night he wouldn't leave. This specific night, Henry was petrified. He made sure that James and Abigail were awake. He came in screaming, "Make him stop, please just make him stop." His parents could sense the sheer terror in Henry's voice. James immediately asked frantically, "Make who stop? Who, Henry?" Henry was in tears and had to take a second to gather his breath, then in a somewhat calm and disturbing tone replied, "Charlie." It took them a minute to realize the full impact of what Henry just told them. You see, Henry's parents never mentioned to him that he was supposed to have a twin named Charlie that merged with him in the womb. They kept it a secret and simply told him that the face on the back of his head was just a very unlucky coincidence. His parents were now also terrified by what Henry had told them, but they were also very tired and told Henry, "We don't know what's wrong with you, but we will figure it out in the morning after we get some rest." Henry, still in tears, starts to turn around and walk out of the room. As he leaves the room, James and Abigail see Charlie's face on the back of Henry's head with eyes wide open and a horrific smile. There is a house on the edge of my local woods. I can see it from my bedroom window. It's not a very large or particularly impressive house, nor is it spooky or frightening in any manner of outward appearances. It's actually quite cute and cozy looking. Little white front porch and all that whimsical bullshit. But people say it's all a front. They say there's something very wrong with that house. They think it eats people. People go in and they don't come out. Not once. And I can hear them screaming. Sometimes they scream for hours. Sometimes only for a few minutes. Sometimes they make it several minutes with no sound at all. And people feel a bit of hope again. But in the end, they always scream. See, that house isn't a house. It just looks like one. Nobody knows who owns it. We all watched the construction crews as they built that little house from the ground up. But nobody ever moved in after the house was built. Months and months flew by, and it still sat empty. Then the rumors started, as they always do, that the house was cursed. Danielle and Tony Breer volunteered to be the first to go inside. They were the first to try everything, the perfect power couple. Their love and fascination couldn't save them. They never came back out. That was the first of many hundreds of screams. Before we all stopped going outside, there used to be whispers among us, the lip-synced rumors that circulate through every tight-knit community such as ours. Some said that it was a demon sent to kill us all. Some believed that the house itself was normal, but that something very dangerous lived inside. Some even thought it was the very devil's own home, and that once one went inside, they would be trapped for eternity. But of course, none of these theories could be proved, because no one who had ever gone in had ever returned to tell the tale. Word spread through the surrounding communities about this house that eats people, and soon thrill seekers of all types came to prove their bravery over the latest haunted house. Men and women of many ages and varieties came to check the house out. Not one of them ever came back, but they all screamed. Oh yes, they did. Someone got the brilliant idea to send a drone through the house instead of a live body. Jeff Rossi down the street from me, I think. We watched him stand in the middle of the street and fly his fancy new drone right through the open door of the house. We watched the screen like a bunch of collective sheep, so we all saw the drone explode right as it crossed the threshold of that cursed house, and that was the end of that. Since sending people in didn't seem to end too well, and drones were too expensive to keep experimenting with, our next idea was to try and simply get rid of it. Jack Keller doused it with gasoline and set it on fire, but the flames just wickered out every time, wouldn't stay lit. Poor Jack though, some of the gasoline leaked on his clothes and he caught fire. The heat was so intense, none of us could get close enough to put it out. Thankfully he lived, but the doctor said he'd have to live with the itch for a while as the skin grafts heal. It's a shame they couldn't do anything with his eyebrows before he disappeared though. Then we tried to mow it down with Pete Jensen's Ram 3500. When he hit the side of the house, the front of his truck crumpled like a paper bag, didn't even scratch the paint on the siding of the house. We all clearly heard the rain-soaked twig snap off his neck when he flew through the windshield. His body still laying there on the hood of his truck. Didn't none of us want to touch him with his eyes open in that frozen way, and with that huge piece of glass sticking out of his throat? Then Doe Wilson decided he was going to take some spare dynamite from the quarry where he worked and just blow the fucker up. The dynamite just wouldn't blow. Doug rolled it off as a dud and went to go get it and blew as he got closer. Took off the lower half of his right leg and his right hand. He used to say that the hardest thing about the prosthetics was that they were uncomfortable. He also used to joke that he got a new hand and still couldn't play the piano. I miss him a lot. After Doug's dynamite failed, we all just sort of gave up. We decided that we would just stay away from the house. So we all went about our normal business. But then, Macy Linden's best friend's cousin, Tom Werner, from the next town over, decided he wanted to take the risk on a triple dog there and come see the house for himself. We all told him not to, but he didn't listen. I think maybe he was one of the loudest screamers. Eventually, someone else brought the idea up that maybe all the people that were going in and not coming back were actually feeding the house and making it stronger somehow. Because after Tom Werner was killed, the house started to make noises. Loud moans and groans could be heard coming through the open door. Sometimes a stiff wind blew out. This activity attracted ghost hunters from all over, and the house was swamped for weeks with amateurs armed with cameras and fancy expensive equipment. They all went in, but still no one came out. The local police chief, Dan Green, came out with the force to investigate the house. He was a good friend of mine. We used to have barbecues every weekend and go on fishing trips together all the time. They went in armed with body armor and fully automatic assault rifles. I'm told there was a well-placed sniper shot to each of their heads, but nobody else was seen going in or out and no shots were heard. Then the priest came. He was sent from the local Catholic diocese to bless the house and perform an exorcism. He came with his Bible and his pretty brightly colored vestments and his holy water. The whispers got back to me that someone had seen his headless body impaled to the living room wall as they passed by. Then everybody truly gave up. The papers warned everyone to stay away from the house of death. The media spun an incredible story about some type of infectious bacteria with the structure of the house itself. People finally got the hint and stopped coming to see the house. Nobody wanted to potentially catch something deadly. After all, no one is more concerned over a life than that shown over their own. Now everyone just stays away from the house and nobody's died for a while. So the screams have stopped. I'm actually kind of grateful for the break. I was running out of creative ways to kill people, and I'm very tired. And Lord knows I hate killing the same way twice. But I do so love the screams, and word always gets around eventually. One way or another, they'll come again. They always do.